Now, let me tell you the real downside of remote work, though, and I don't think this gets talked about enough. Remote work obviously became a very big topic with COVID for a variety of reasons. By the way, remote work was not unheard of at that point in time. I remember a good friend of mine, Tony Conrad, he had a company at True Ventures that was a fully remote company 5 years before COVID. And I remember he was beating my ear about, 24 employees, 18 different countries. I'm like, how the hell do you do that? And so people knew how to do this before COVID. Right? This is like 2016, 2017. This is 5 years before COVID. And I remember when COVID happened, Tony Conrad was one of the first people I called. I go, remember that company did all remote? Tell me some lessons. Tony gave me some good advice because he had this all remote company from 5 years before. We did Hey Do Pitaco down in Brazil, a fantasy sports company. Nigel Eccles from FanDuel was on the board with me. And we did that fully on remote during COVID, the height of COVID. And we now are the investors in the largest fantasy sports and sports betting company in Brazil. And it was years later, I finally got to meet the founders in person because of COVID. So I am not pro or con remote work. I believe that it has its place. There are times where it's important. But I will give you my funny remote work story with how the world has changed. So as many of you know, my wife Arthi is an early Google employee. I think now in 2025, if there's a dozen people who are still at the company who've been there longer than her, I'd be surprised. Literally like a dozen. She's been there for 23 years. She was in grad school with Larry and Sergey, and we decided in 2010 that we would move back to Philadelphia, and that's where we'd raise our kids. We didn't want to live in Silicon Valley with our kids, and that was never an option for us for a variety of reasons. And so she told her boss, I'm going to quit. I'm going to go to Philly. I'm going to do something else with my life. And she got a call. I forget who. I don't remember if it was Larry or Sergey directly. You can work on remote. This is unheard of. If you know anything about Google culture, if you are not in Mountain View, you do not work for the company at this point in time. This is 2010, so this is 15 years ago. And Arthi was offered to work on remote. And the reason she was offered to work on remote is she basically quit. And she's like, Paul, wow, I learned a really good negotiating point there. I was like, yes, you did learn a really good negotiating point. If you actually don't care, then you might, anyway. So I kid you not, in 2010, there were probably 10,000 employees at Google. If a dozen of them worked on remote, that would be amazing to me. And she was one of the only ones. So people would call her all the time. They go, Arthi, how did you get to work on remote? I want to work on remote. I want to do part-time. It's like, yeah, I quit, and I know the founders, so they called me and said, you can work on remote. So I don't know how useful that is for you. So the lesson wasn't useful. So when COVID happened and remote work became a thing, and half of Google started working on remote, there's this part of us that chuckled a little bit like, wow, that's a real 180. Because now, even now, 5 years post-COVID, there's a significant contingent of the workforce that is remote, where it was religiously not allowed, probably for the first 2 decades of the company. The company was formed in 98. So for the first 2 decades of the company, there's like, count them on 2 hands the number of people who get to work on remote. It has been interesting to see the ways that companies have gone from religious to a-religious to responding to the workforce. Whereas on my point of view, I was always, it's a tool to be used as opposed to, I have a philosophy. Now let me tell you the real downside of remote work though, and I don't think this gets talked about enough. Onboarding new people sucks in remote work. I don't care how good you are in a remote culture. I don't care how good you are on Zoom. Your new employee who just graduated college, who's starting to work your job, it sucks for them. There's no water cooler discussion. There's no osmosis of hanging out in the office. There's no, what's that old saying from one of the famous CEOs? Management by walking around. There's none of that. You're in your bedroom. You're in your basement. You are trying to learn corporate culture on remote. That sucks. And so while I'm not religiously pro or con remote work, it works for some people, it doesn't work. The people who are very pro remote work, I think, do a very bad job onboarding their new employees. And they got to look in the mirror about making that work better in order to make remote work better for their company as a whole.